Many stories, especially those in JRPGs, delve into the concept of free will. These stories tend to focus on the possibility of free will. There has been a long debate of free will versus determinism, a question that has spanned over 2 millennia from Christian traditions and more broadly from the concept of a God, is this: if an omniscient deity really exists, one that knows not only our past but present and also the future, can our will truly be considered free? Therefore, in many JRPG stories, we witness the act of deicide, or killing a god. Symbolically, this represents the triumph of free will over determinism, signifying our power to shape our future. Consequently, the darkest moments in these stories often portray our heroes succumbing to the pessimism and skepticism, feeling that surpassing God's limitations is all but impossible, and free will is nothing but an illusion. However, usually due to the encouragement from comrades or a love interest, our hero finds the resolve to fight against all odds. By the climax, when the god is defeated in a final boss fight, the existence of free will is reaffirmed. And yet, Final Fantasy XVI takes a different path. Throughout the storyline, the central tension isn't about whether we truly possess free will. Although Ultima frequently claims that mere mortals can't break free from his grasp, this doesn't cause Clive or his companions to waver in their belief in free will. In fact, the game's darkest hour isn't even brought about by Ultima. The only time Clive truly loses confidence is after being defeated twice by Barnabas. We'll discuss in detail the ideological clash between Clive and Barnabas later, as I believe this represents the core message that FF16 seeks to convey. Essentially, FF16's narrative is constructed upon generations of JRPG storytelling. It takes as premise that free will indeed exists. The real question it tries to explore is, given that free will does exist, what does that imply for our existence? In philosophy, one of the most pivotal endeavors is to dissect and re-examine the ingrained, preconceived notions we might unknowingly tether to a certain concept. By placing these things under a microscope, we often unveil new avenues of thought. In philosophical discourse, nothing is truly taken for granted. When something appears obvious or a given, it usually signifies a blind spot in our mind. This isn't to say that every obvious notion is inherently flawed, but rather we should consciously scrutinize them. Only by personally delving deep into these ideas can we form independent judgments, rather than unknowingly adopting the value system society bestowed upon us. In everyday practice, we employ vocabulary to represent concepts, and as we use these words, they carry with them a bunch of connotations, sometimes even moral judgments. FF16 wants us to inspect one such concept, a concept we often deem to be positive without much thought, the concept of freedom. So before delving into our analysis, I hope you can, during this video, suspend value judgments about freedom. Regardless of what you hear about freedom in the next hour or so, don't label them as simply good or bad. Instead, view them as mere objective facts. We can make more judgments once we have analyzed these facts. Compared to other JRPG storytellers, UCP's narrative style is exceptionally rigorous, with clear logical threads. It often feels to me like an interactive thesis. This becomes evident when looking at FF14's main scenario quests. Starting from A Realm Reborn and culminating in Endwalker, UCP takes the player through a journey of philosophical history. It's an exploration that touches on the ancients' essentialism, Amon's nihilism, Xenos' hedonism, and Heideling's existentialism. If anyone's interested, I could delve deeper into FF14's philosophical discussion in another video. In contrast, FF16, with its roughly 40-hour storyline, allows UCP to focus the discourse on one theme, that is the implications of freedom. But before diving into the nuances of freedom, some definitions and premises must be clarified. The game roughly follows a linear approach to its philosophical discourse. That is, the early parts deal with the definitions and premises, whereas the later parts consist of the main body of the discourse. So what are these definitions and premises? Firstly, freedom is a concept rooted in the present, anchored firmly on the foundation of our reality. One's reality has many aspects. It's not just our body and flesh, not just the events and experiences that unfold in our lives. It extends to the historical and cultural contexts in which we were born and raised. Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset once said, "Yo soy yo y mi circunstancia," which translates to "I am me and my circumstances." So what are these circumstances? They encompass everything beyond our subjective consciousness. In FF16's narrative, when someone is randomly born as a bearer, they inherit a set of circumstances. This not only includes their magical abilities, but also societal definitions and expectations associated with being a bearer in their respective nation. It even encapsulates all the emotions ever invoked across Storm and Ash throughout history every time the word bearer is uttered. These are immutable external facts. As one grows, everything that happened to him, every action he took, they become part of these circumstances too. So if even our past actions fall outside the realm of freedom, what is freedom then? Simply put, taking from "I am me and my circumstances," freedom is the me part. It is our consciousness, our subjective lens, viewing our circumstances and deciding what to do with them. Jean-Paul Sartre, grandmaster of existentialism, as he puts it, consciousness is freedom. In the early stages of the story, Clive struggles with accepting his identity as Ifrit. When he finally reconciles with this truth, he confides in Sid.
"I am a dominant, Ifrit. And there is nothing I can do to change that. It is a burden I must bear until my dying day."
Spoken true. Forgiveness and in turn salvation can only begin with acceptance.
To accept is not about embracing fate or predestination. It's about acknowledging our circumstances, those elements of our past we can't change, and the current realities we find ourselves in. It is upon this foundation of acceptance that we can exercise our free choices. Another dimension to the scope of freedom is the common misconception about its meaning. Many people magnify freedom and believe it to be doing whatever we want. This is a big misinterpretation. That isn't freedom, that's godhood. You're thinking about godhood. As previously mentioned, our actions are inherently bound by limits. Suppose I wish to fly to the sun, walk on its surface. Biological constraints make it impossible. I can't do what I want. Yet I wouldn't say, "Oh, how unfree I am. I don't have wings, I have to breathe oxygen, and what's with this squishy body that can't even stand 5,000 degrees Celsius? I'm so not free." I wouldn't say that because for humans, freedom essentially means choosing not to do something if we don't wish to. Naturally, we must bear the consequences and responsibilities of our inactions. For example, I can choose not to breathe, but I must accept that I would die. Still, this choice is very much within my purview of freedom. This raises a question: how should one perceive freedom in the context of beings like Ultima, which are genuinely godlike? Well, stick around to find out. After talking about the scope of freedom, there's still one part missing about the premise of our philosophical discussion. That is the subject of freedom. Who is exercising that freedom? At first glance, this question is ridiculous. Why, me, of course. I am exercising my freedom. But just like everything else in philosophy, it's usually the stuff we think as self-explanatory where we find the most interesting and eye-opening discussion. To talk about this, the game presents us with the storyline where Clive finds out who Ifrit really is. This fact itself is nothing surprising. I mean, even if you didn't watch any promotional material before the game's launch, is there really anyone who was shocked by the revelation that he is Ifrit? The weight of this revelation comes with its implication that it was him who killed Joshua, the very person he had vowed to take revenge on for 13 years was himself. This is utterly devastating, something straight out of a Greek tragedy. The only problem is, well, Joshua isn't dead. So when Clive confronts his past as Phoenix Gate, as players we're thinking, oh Clive, don't cry, your brother is out there traveling the world with a beautiful girl by his side. But it's crucial to remember that Clive, at this moment, doesn't know Joshua is alive. Not only that, what overwhelms him is not just the perceived death of Joshua, but also the death of Murdoch and the indirect role he played in the downfall of Rosaria, which also led to Jill and many others to be captured and enslaved. If I had to nitpick, I would say that the game revealed Joshua's identity a bit too soon. There was no need to tell us who he was during his journey to Rosaria in his conversation with Rotti. It would have been a lot more effective to keep the players in dark thinking Joshua was dead until the moment Clive comes out of Phoenix Gate, and that would be where Joshua takes off his hood. This would have made Clive's acceptance of his past at Phoenix Gate more powerful, because Joshua, more than Murdoch, or the fate of Rosaria for that matter, was the emotional focal point of the player at this stage. Returning to my main point, the segment where Clive comes to terms with being Ifrit's dominant is by no means superfluous. It is intricately tied to FF16's central theme of freedom. Let's think about this question. If Joshua really died, is Clive responsible for his death? It's a tough question. Clearly, he never wanted to harm Joshua. The trauma was so severe that he lived in denial for 13 years. He simply lost control. In real life, there aren't any dominant capable of transforming into giant monsters on a whim, and if there are, they've done a very good job hiding. But you know what we do have? Emotions. Every one of us in our daily lives has said or done something we later regretted. Upon reflection, we often say, well, I lost control. I didn't choose to say or do those things. I was just overwhelmed by emotions. Yet this is a deflection of responsibility. It's a coping mechanism because the concept of absolute freedom is terrifying. Sartre described it as sort of vertigo, akin to the dizzy sensation when you look down from a precipice. Why do you have this dizziness? Sartre would say it's not because we are imagining the terrible consequences of having fallen to the ground. No, the real reason behind this dizziness is that you realize you have the possibility to jump. We genuinely possess that freedom. You just lean forward a little bit, let gravity do its work, and down you go. There's not going to be some kind of invisible force to yank you back and say, "Thou shalt not jump." If we have some kind of barrier at the edge, we would feel better because it restricts our freedom to jump. If we were, say, tethered to a tree, we'd feel even better because the choice of jumping is taken away completely. We couldn't sabotage ourselves even if we wanted to. By surrendering control and freedom, what we're trying to do is to avoid that existential dizziness and the responsibilities we carry for our actions. When we attribute our actions to emotions, subconsciousness, or even social conditioning, we are effectively diminishing the concept of our self. It's as if a part of our self, there is a little demon living inside us, influencing and even controlling our actions. Well, it wasn't me who attacked that man on the street. The little demon called emotion did it. I was merely a spectator. The game's cinematography perfectly reflects this concept. In Clive's memories of Joshua's death, we always see Ifrit through a third-person perspective, as a spectator. This coping mechanism shields us from guilt and responsibility that otherwise might be devastating to us.
And I blamed another for what I did, to spare myself the guilt. I feared that by accepting it, I would lose what little was left of me. So I ran from everything.
But if we accept this little demon narrative, Yes, we don't need to feel bad if we kill someone on the street, but it also means we can't truly take pride or find joy in our actions of kindness. Because by that logic, if I see a little girl on the street about to be hit by a car, and I charge forward and save her from certain death, I can't feel good about this action because it wasn't me who saved that girl. I was just overwhelmed by emotion. That little demon, or in this case, the little angel, it comes out, takes control, and I was just a spectator. When Clive confronts his shadow and engages the limit break for the first time, the in-game prompt reads, press L3 and R3 to accept the truth. So what is this truth? Well, the truth is, there is no little demon inside us. Or rather, that little demon is part of our self. To confront this existential vertigo is challenging, but if we want our action to have any meaning, we must confront this truth head-on. Otherwise, we would be merely robots, programmed to act in a certain way, and any value our actions may have can only be attributed to the hand that remotely controls us, be it God, subconsciousness, natural instinct, what have you. This is the default state many people find themselves in, both in the story and in real life.
Be they bearers or beggars, most march blindly to their end, never realizing that they too deserve a choice.
So coming back to this question, who is exercising this freedom? Well, ourself, our entire self. To leave the responsibility to our emotions or subconsciousness is nothing but self-deception. Some of you might say, okay, what you said might be true in a vacuum, but we're not living in a vacuum, we live in a society. And the fact about that life is, in a society, there are just many things we have to do. The society takes away certain aspects of my freedom, and there's just nothing I can do about it. To demonstrate this line of thinking, the first part of the story introduces us to the freedom or the lack of freedom in the institutional sense. Many people might feel that FF16's depiction of the socio-political system is rather cursory, oversimplifying slavery. In reality, slavery has a multifaceted foundation deeply rooted in political, economic, and cultural intricacies. It's not as simple as testing a newborn and say, slave material right there, and then you're a slave. But in my view, this oversimplification was a deliberate choice by the creators. Events in the real world can be driven by many complex forces, and it can be challenging to dissect them. Fictional narratives, however, can exaggerate and simplify certain aspects, emphasizing the core message. As I mentioned earlier, the philosophical discourse of FF16 story is based on the premise that we are born free. Even gods cannot really deprive us of that inherited freedom, let alone society. The exaggerated and simplified depiction of the fictional socio-political structure ultimately serves to bolster this argument of the inherent freedom. And to do that, the game seeks to answer a seemingly straightforward question. If we are born free, why do we often feel not free? In the real-life slavery, both the slaves and the masters are ordinary humans. They don't have any intrinsic difference. Actually, a prevailing notion in slave societies is the idea that slaves are slaves because they are inferior, primitive, and less capable. They need guidance and civilization from their masters. Even the great Aristotle promotes this idea of natural slaves. While this may seem to be the case, the existence, or at least the consolidation of this reality, is a consequence of slavery itself, leading to a chicken or the egg problem. To highlight that this slave's inferiority isn't relevant, FX16 deliberately avoids this discussion. In the story, the bearers are, in fact, more powerful than the average human, yet they find themselves at the bottom of the social ladder.
Save for our knack, dominants and bearers are no different from anyone else. The ability to use magic or summon great beasts should command respect, but instead is left as outcasts. Our kind are used and discarded like tools, yet we are men, so why must we die as less?
Through this, the creators aim to underscore that these external forces trying to limit our freedom are arbitrary social constructs, and this arbitrariness manifests in three distinct ways. The first is the arbitrariness in degree. Different nations, although all discriminatory against bearers, varied greatly in their treatment. While the empire seeks to forever imprison bearers at the lowest social strata through toxic brands, Rosaria adopts a softer, more amiable approach. No matter what nation a bearer is born into, he's still a bearer, so why the difference? Well, because different societies have different social constructs, which naturally leads to the different levels of suppression against bearer freedom. The second is the arbitrariness in method. Dominants are essentially a unique type of bearer. Even though bearers are looked down upon, the moment someone is identified as a dominant, they generally become a pillar of society, taking roles such as kings, generals, national mascots, what have you. The power of dominance surpasses the society's ability to limit freedom through sheer force. A battalion of armored soldiers can suppress a few rebellious bearers, but each of the 7 icons have the power to obliterate entire nations. Therefore, society adopts a different method to constrain them, turning them into social figureheads. So it becomes clear that there is nothing inherently reprehensible about being a bearer or being a dominant. Their vilification or veneration is merely a manner in which society restricts their freedom. Case in point, there are scenarios, such as with Jill, where even as a dominant, her freedom is taken through coercion and threats. Social constructs really just resort to the most convenient way to maintain control. This is precisely why Sid is considered a thorn in the side of every nation. As outlaw, he adheres neither to any nation's social contract nor international norms. His very existence reveals that what deprives the freedom of bearers and dominants is not some kind of universal law or how things should be, but rather the will of social constructs. Finally, there's the arbitrariness in history. Through Vivian's side quest, we learn that bearers weren't always looked down upon. There was even a time they were respected and adored. This serves as evidence that this idea that bearers should be slaves, this idea isn't like an immutable truth. The revelation of this history will expose the social construct for what it is, and that's why Vivian and Clive are targeted for assassination. The social constructs have power because the will of the majority believe that this is how the world should be, and it uses this power to shape the world accordingly. So in a way, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the area of international relations, there is a famous saying by Alexander Wendt. He says, "Anarchy is what states make of it." We are in this situation because we have been believing, and we are still believing, that there is just no other way. This is why Vivian remarks that absolute truth doesn't exist. Beliefs also have the power to change reality, because beliefs manifest in social constructs, which in turn are the key to shape the world we live in. But before we dive even deeper, let's remind ourselves not to jump to moral judgments. It is so easy to think, oh, social constructs are taking away my freedom? What a terrible thing. It must be some kind of final boss for us to defeat, right? But wait, these social constructs that take away our freedom, they aren't born out of malice or spite, at least not always. In some cases, the act of losing one's freedom isn't even detrimental. That is, as long as he or she recognizes and willingly accepts the implication of such a loss. You might be wondering, how can losing one's freedom be a good thing? Well, because when society takes away your freedom, it doesn't always do so without giving anything in return. Take Clive's homeland, Rosaria, for instance. We all have a soft spot for Rosaria, but the reality is, it's doing the same thing. It also takes away freedom. It places a duty upon the dominant of Phoenix to protect and lead the people of Rosaria. And it also places a duty upon the shields of Rosaria to protect the Phoenix. From this perspective, both Joshua and Clive are bound by this role and are, in essence, not free. The night at Phoenix Gate, Joshua asks his father a question.
Why is it that the dominance is always born into our family? It doesn't seem fair.
We cannot live without the blessing of the crystals. and the crystals work their magic through us. You have been blessed, Joshua. Blessed to be a dominant, to wield the power of an icon. Our family has been chosen to share that power with the people. So that is what we must do.
When Joshua says it's not fair, I don't think he means, oh, the phoenix so powerful, why the others don't get to fly around on fire? What he's truly struggling with is this question. Why does our family, and our family alone, have to bear the weight of the entire duchy on our shoulders? Elwin's response is basically, with great power comes great responsibility. And judging by Joshua's reaction, clearly this answer isn't very satisfying to him. Because in essence, Elwin's statement is just reiterating that arbitrary social construct that binds Joshua. As one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment age, David Hume points out, throughout history there is a fundamental assumption that people keep making, that if something is, it must mean it ought to be. Aristotle looks around and sees all these slaves don't have much ability to reason, so he concludes, oh, this must be because they are made to be slaves. They don't have reason because they don't need to. They ought to be slaves. Similarly, the phoenix has the power to protect the duchy and has always protected the duchy, so the phoenix must be born to protect the duchy. He must do so. But clearly there is a glaring logical leap here. To understand why Joshua have to bear this duty, it can actually be broken down using this logic. Joshua is the dominant of Phoenix. All dominants of the Phoenix have the responsibility to protect the duchy. Therefore, Joshua also has the responsibility to protect the duchy. Let's analyze that logic. First things first, Joshua didn't choose to be the dominant of Phoenix. He was born into it. This doesn't necessarily mean his freedom was stripped away. As we established earlier, freedom is a concept rooted in the present, based on one's state of being, or as Ortega y Gasset would phrase it, based on one's circumstances. Being the phoenix is Joshua's circumstance. Theoretically, he could choose never to summon the phoenix power. He could spread his wings and fly away. What truly robs him of his freedom is the second statement. All dominants of Phoenix must protect the duchy. Now this is clearly a social construct. I mean, the Phoenix doesn't have Guardian of Rosaria etched onto its beak. Think of real-life parallels. We all might know someone incredibly talented in a certain field, yet they work in a completely unrelated job. We might feel that it's a waste. We might think, if they worked in that field, they could have achieved so much more. We respect their freedom, so we say nothing. Now imagine if everyone is constantly judging them, forcing them into a role they didn't want. That is how social constructs rob freedom. This is what Joshua was worrying about. Of course, he's not saying he doesn't want to see the duchy protected, but it's a hard job. He might not be up for it, yet he has to do it. As the Phoenix, social expectations are robbing him of his free choices. In his moment of doubt, it was Clive who offered him some sort of clarity.
Every man has his duty. Ours was decided long ago, when our ancestors chose to instate the dominant as the Archduke of Rosaria. All to ensure that whenever our nation stood on a precipice, the phoenix would rise from the flames to drag us back from the brink. The fate of Rosaria sits on the dominant's shoulders. It is your duty to bear that burden.
What about you?
I was born to be your shield. That is why I was given the Phoenix's blessing. To keep our future rulers safe. No matter what. However hard it gets. I'll never let you down.
Unlike Elwin, Clive not only acknowledges the social construct, but further assures Joshua that it's not malicious. Their ancestors had a vision for a brighter, safer, and more prosperous future. And also, perhaps more importantly, by accepting his social role, Clive earns the opportunity to protect the brother he loves. This might just be the answer Joshua seeks. By embracing his duty as Phoenix, by sacrificing his freedom to an extent, he gets to stand side by side with the people he loves, fighting for the home that he holds dear. This is how the social constructs take away freedom. They trade our freedom in exchange for something else, something we value. Now that we have got the definition and social mechanism of freedom out of the way, there is still one thing left before the game can talk about the implications of freedom. The point being, despite the necessity of sacrificing part of our freedom to live in a society, why do we still strive so hard for freedom? I mean, aren't human beings social animals? Why don't we just surrender every bit of freedom altogether to society and others? We see this discussed in-game through Benedicta Harmon, our main antagonist before the time skip. Benedicta was once a slave, dreaming of freedom after being rescued by Sid. But by the time we meet her in the story, she has become an integral part of the social construct. She helps King Barnabas to hunt down other bearers and dominants.
I only know what you used to say. That you were tired of running. That you just wanted to be free. Free of it all. You weren't lying to me then, so what changed? What made you think you had to sacrifice who you were to get what you wanted?
Sacrifice. I use my talents to my advantage, and you would tell me there is shame in that?
Even though she doesn't realize she made a sacrifice, she did. She sacrificed her own dreams of freedom and relies solely on the will of King Barnabas. She's giving herself unto some kind of authority figure and trusts them to exercise freedom in her stead. This is what Sartre would call bad faith. We do this in real world all the time. For example, when we choose a career, how many of us just make a decision not because how much we love the craft, but instead because our parents, our friends, our teachers, our society just tell us it's a good job? And to Sartre, the most ironic thing is, these people that we see as authority figures, those people that we delegate our freedom to, they are as clueless as we are when it comes to life as a journey. This is translated perfectly into the story of the game. When we later see the path that Barnabas took, we realize he's also just following another quote-unquote authority figure, in this case Ultima. The consequence of delegating our freedom, according to Sartre, is that we are not living authentically. The lack of authenticity means we are actively denying part of ourself. In my opinion, that is the source of Benedicta's profound anguish. Her hatred of the world is but a psychological redirection of the hatred she has for herself. This is evident when Sid remarks on her self-pity. It immediately breaks her defenses. She understands that despite her high rank and being an object of desire, it isn't her sole aspiration or her authentic self. As the game progresses towards the conclusion, Clive is transported into like a virtual world by Ultima. In this world, the main antagonists are imprisoned. Each one of them has a line that encapsulates what makes them the villains they are. Benedicta's line is a plea, a cry for love and connection.
Please, won't somebody save me? Won't anybody love me?
She doesn't think anyone could ever love her because she is not who she is, at least not completely. There is another part of her, the part that wanted to run away and be an outlaw with Sid. She denied her because it's just the easier path. After she was killed by Ifrit, Sid went to her body.
Why? Why did you have to listen to him? Benner. This can't be what you wanted, can it?
The fact is, she didn't have to listen to Barnabas. She could have run away, she could have become an outlaw, maybe she would have been happier, or maybe she would have found a new way of hating the other part of herself who craves honor and power. We'll never know, but one thing we can say for sure, freedom and authenticity are the fundamental block upon which genuine interpersonal relationships can be built. If we value our ability to love and be loved, we must give our freedom the respect it deserves. By this time, the premise of FS16's philosophical discourse is fully established. We, as human beings, are born with an inherent freedom rooted in our circumstances. We sacrifice it to an extent when we engage in society and with others, But we don't sacrifice it entirely. We maintain a balance of authenticity and inauthenticity to establish love and connection. All of this sacrifice is still a free process, even though it's easy to mistake it for just how the human is. The story that begins 5 years later is the main philosophical discourse of the game. It concerns the title of this video, The Weight of Freedom. It's often said that the quality of the story hinges on its antagonists. I think this misses the mark by a tiny margin. It isn't the quality of the antagonists themselves that makes the story shine, but rather the dynamics and chemistry between the antagonists and the protagonists. Ideally, the two should have some kind of parallel in their backstories, but end up on ideological opposites, highlighting their clash of ideas. Where FF16 shines narratively is that each antagonist embodies a fundamental ideological clash with Clive and his friends. They challenge Clive, and by extension the player, with key philosophical ideas and, dare I say, mistakes on their journey. The first major quest we embark on after the time skip is to go with Jill to the Iron Kingdom to destroy Drake's Breath. Here we meet the leader of Crystallian Orthodox, also Jill's nemesis, Imran. By this time in our philosophical discourse, we are clear on the defining qualities of freedom, so it's time to fight for it. Time to create a world where people can live and die on their terms, right? But wait, here is where we start to feel the real weight of freedom. The world is not a perfect place. Not everybody is willing to let everybody else have freedom. There are always these oppressors, as the 20th century existentialist Simone de Beauvoir would call them, oppressors that seek to take the freedom from others. And they won't go down without a fight, so it's unavoidable for us, the champion of freedom, to clash with them. Sometimes, and even most of the times, physically, with brute force. Then, in that scenario, aren't we turning into oppressors that take away their freedom? You can certainly argue that taking other people's freedom is not within their freedom to begin with, so we're not taking their freedom when we take away their ability to take away other people's freedom. Well, that's a mouthful. After all, we have established that freedom is not the ability to do whatever we want. But what if they just won't relinquish? They just fight to the bitter end. And we have to lock them up, incapacitate them, and even kill them. Wouldn't that be crossing a line? And here's an extra food for thought. What about collateral damage? By fighting these monsters, are we turning into monsters of our own making? It is not something Clive hadn't thought about, even 5 years ago.
But what of all the people you mean to rob of their comforts? Are you happy for them to call you outlaw?
I mean, this is why Jill never stood up to the Iron Kingdom when they forced her to prime and fight for them. In this sense, fighting for freedom becomes this incredibly delicate matter, ambiguous if you will. That's where the weight of freedom starts to show. If we are free, then we have to assume the responsibility, the full responsibility of our actions. And sometimes it means others, even the innocents, will suffer for it. But Simone de Beauvoir would say, it shouldn't stop us from striving for a better tomorrow. Remember, by not taking action, you are also allowing those innocents to suffer. The only difference is you're not being actively targeted and criticized. So this is really a terrible situation we find ourselves in. The burden weighs upon us either way. We can only try our best, like Jill did before she went to the inner sanctum to kill the Patriarch. She told Lady Marley what she would do and asked her to seek refuge. She tried her best to minimize the suffering. But there's another layer. Even if we believe we're doing everything we can, our feeble human mind is just not made to perceive certainty. We have made a myriad of mistakes since we were born, so who's to say this is not just another on the pile? We will forever be plagued by the doubt that perhaps we chose wrong, that there was a better way. Maybe there truly was. Maybe in taking our free action for freedom, we caused an ocean of suffering that in retrospect could have been avoided. Like when Clive killed Benedicta, he couldn't foresee Hugo Kupka would be so driven by revenge that he took it out not only on the hideaway, but also the many bearers he used as bait to lure him out. In that case, is Clive a terrible person? A monster, as Imran would call him? Simone de Beauvoir would say no. After freeing some bearers who criticized them for causing them only suffering, Jill was eager to explain and try to convince them that it's for their own good. But Clive stops her.
For 5 years we fought to secure a better life for our kind. To see that we are treated as equals. Do you not want that?
What we want is to be left alone. Every time you show your faces, it is we who suffer.
It's all right. I'm sorry.
If you ask me, that is what separates us from monsters. To embrace the responsibilities of our free will, carry that weight of freedom, and show respect and humility. Speaking of Kupka, he shows us another layer of this weight of freedom. In the prison scene I mentioned earlier, Kupka's line was about desire unfulfilled.
I yearn, yet still she is not mine. Have I not given enough?
This line speaks volume about Kupka's inner turmoil, the anguish of realizing something is missing in his life. In this case, the woman he loves. Earlier we touched on Sartre's consciousness is freedom. Yet he also said that consciousness is nothingness. At first glance, this might seem paradoxical, even downright terrifying. But I promise, once we understand it, it has a poetic beauty to it. For Sartre, existence manifests in two ways: being in itself and being for itself. While it might be an oversimplification, for now you can think of these as matter and mind, respectively. Being in itself represents this tangible, concrete reality, what Sartre would call fully positive. Everything within this form of existence undeniably exists. Things that don't exist cannot be part of it. It might sound weird and self-explanatory, and yet subjectively, we often perceive some kind of non-existence or absence in our world. So where does this absence come from? Take Sartre's example in his book Being and Nothingness. If we go to a cafe to meet our friend Pierre, we arrive and we want to check if Pierre is already there. How do we do that? We don't go, oh, this man here is not Pierre, that lady there is not Pierre, that coffee table is not Pierre, or there's some light shining through the window, that's not Pierre, so on and so forth until we can say, okay, I checked everything in this cafe, none of them is Pierre, so Pierre must not be here. No, that's not what happens. What happens instead is that we just perceive an absence, a lack of Pierre. Beyond mere absence, we also perceive the redundancy and potentiality. Imagine a room with a single yellow chair. In our mind's eye, we can also see the same room with two chairs, meaning there is an absence, or no chair, meaning there is a redundancy. We can even imagine the chair in a different color, size, or design, meaning the room has potentiality. If these non-existent beings, like absence, redundancy, and potentiality, is not part of the tangible reality of matter, of being in itself, where do they come from? Sartre would say that they come from being for itself, our consciousness. When our consciousness engages with reality, it perceives not only what it is, but also what it isn't. This gives rise to desire. Sleipnir's line in the prison is a manifestation of this idea.
From will is born desire, and it is this which consumes you, rendering you incomplete.
Kupka's pain takes root in his desire for Benedicta. While we might condemn his actions, we cannot deny the authenticity of his pain. In this sense, we find that the root of all suffering comes from our ability to perceive non-existence. It comes from our consciousness. This is the second layer to the weight of freedom. It makes us suffer. Some philosophers, like Arthur Schopenhauer, would go so far to say life is a constant suffering, because even if your desire is met somehow, soon the fulfilled desire would just become the new norm, and you will find a new desire to endlessly strive and suffer for. Understanding this sheds light on the fervent wish of King Barnabas to relinquish free will and wholly devote himself to his deity Ultima. Without free will, without consciousness, there is no perception of absence, so there is no suffering. But Sartre would say, you're just focusing on the negative side of nothingness. Being for itself does not only recognize absence, it also has directionality. It sees potential in existence, and it is through being for itself that existence gets to grow and change. You might think of desire as this source of all pain in life, but another name for desire might be hopes and dreams. Take Mid, for example. She's an inventor, Her entire job is to recognize what reality lacks and make that into reality. She dreams of creating an airship. Although she faced numerous setbacks, and even by the end of the story she never achieved her goal, she never succumbs to despair. Instead, it is precisely the unrealized potential that points to her a way forward. Perhaps Mid might never succeed in building her airship. Maybe her students will, or maybe not even them. But what is valuable to us individually is not possessing the thing we desire. Instead, it is the constant pursuit that matters. If we just obsess over getting what we desire, we keep adding things and modifying the being in itself, our being for itself will always find something more to desire, always find something lacking. And the more tragic part is, if someday we really achieve the final thing we desire, reached utter perfection, there is nothing to be desired anymore, it would be terrifying. It would mean we're all done. It would mean we're standing at the highest peak and the only direction left is downward.
Some say there was a time they blocked out the stars. Down was the only way left for them to go. There's probably a lesson to be learned from that.
If someone were to ask me which antagonist from FF16 best contrasts Clive, I wouldn't hesitate for a second, it's King Barnabas. If you ever played Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Barnabas' dynamic with Clive is just like the one between Jin and Rex. Their ideological parallels are so profound, it makes their differences all the more striking. We previously discussed how Clive chose to embrace the truth, to accept freedom, and by extension responsibility. We talked about the little demon we might think to be living within us, how we must recognize that there is no little demon, only ourselves, and that without accepting this, our actions lose their moral meaning. Barnabas was faced with the same thing, but he just went full speed to the other direction. He would say, so what if I can't take credit for my good actions? No, the guilt and responsibility on the other side is a lot more unbearable, so to reduce suffering, it is only reasonable that we make this trade-off. And you know what? Forget about reducing suffering. You're thinking too small. If denying part of our freedom reduces our suffering, why not just take a step further? We deny the entirety of our freedom, and suffering would just cease to exist. To him, free will is humanity's core issue, our original sin, if you will.
You see, paradise lies but a single step away. Could we only take it? Could we only leave our transgressions behind?
The thinking is, by dedicating ourselves entirely to another being or cause, we forsake our freedom and thus we rid ourselves of pain and suffering, because we lose the ability of our conscious mind to perceive it. In real life, we see this in some religious zealots, where it can seem that they are mentally invincible. No matter what you do to them, they can just chalk it up to God's will. It is as if they have completely lost their freedom, as though they stand on the precipice but securely tethered to a tree. Push them as hard as you like, they just won't fall, tightly bound as they are to their beliefs. To me, that is why Barnabas is so powerful, because his convictions, mistaken as they are almost unbreakable. He's the only one against whom Clive doubts himself, wondering how ever he could beat him. As a player, you might want to ask, didn't Clive already decide to accept the truth? Hadn't he already done that at Phoenix Gate? Why lose faith now? Shouldn't he be just as resolute, if not more than King Barnabas? That's where it gets interesting. Because you see, choosing to accept freedom and all the responsibility it carries is not only a more difficult path than simply surrendering, it is also a path that you must constantly walk. Sartre talked about the psyche of a gambler. One day this gambler realizes his addiction is ruining his life and he resolves to change. He swears to stay away from the casino. In this moment, he embraces his free will to choose his own path. But it's not like he hits a button and all the casinos would just cease to exist for him. Anytime he walks past a casino, he faces a new choice: to keep resolute or to fall back to his old habits. There's nothing impeding him from abandoning his resolution, nothing other than himself. Just like when we talked about the man standing on a precipice, there is nothing stopping him from jumping down other than himself. And this is yet another burden of freedom. Just as you can freely decide to become the best version of yourself, you can also abandon that path at any moment and renounce all that you worked so hard for, because it's just the easier path. There's nothing holding you back. For Clive at this moment, the man who accepted the truth and embraced freedom 5 years ago, he is a memory rather than his current reality. He is his circumstance rather than himself. He must rediscover his resolve, holding onto it each moment if he's to stand firm against Barnabas. And it's precisely here, in the final clash between the two, that we discover the fatal flaw of King Barnabas. If you've been paying attention, you may realize I've been beating around the bush. When I described the situation of King Barnabas, I said it's as if he had lost his freedom. And that is the key word here, as if. When he was defeated by Clive, he thought his problem was that he cast away his will, so he doesn't have what Clive has, and that's why he failed.
Perhaps there is strength in will. Would that I had not relinquished my own.
You relinquished nothing. What was it, if not will, that made you strive for a new world? Strive to win your master's approval. You were shown a fantasy, and you chose to believe it.
Just like Clive said, Barnabas didn't really lose freedom. He merely created the illusion of not being free. In fact, he didn't surrender his freedom forever. There's a way to surrender freedom for good in the game. It's called turning Akashic. Once turned, you don't have any will anymore. You are functionally dead. Whatever remains in that blue body is not you, it's just your circumstances, now with a surplus of ether. But Barnabas didn't turn, at least not prior to the final battle. What he did was to freely choose to comply with Ultima's every command at every turn. In this sense, we're really condemned to freedom, as Sartre famously puts. No matter what we do, as long as we live, we can't get rid of it. In our analogy of the man chained to the tree on the precipice, there is actually no rope binding the man to the tree. He's just hugging the tree with his own arms and hands because looking down from the precipice gives him vertigo. It fills him with dread and fear, seeing the potential downfall that his free choice can bring about. So he takes the easy way out. He resorts to the tree. Now he doesn't have to worry about falling anymore, but in so doing, he denied the possibility of ever leaving the precipice altogether. He's just standing there, static, grateful that he will never feel the pain of falling. Some would say, and I imagine Barnabas would say, so what? Who says I have to leave the precipice? Who says out there is not just another precipice and another and another? At least I have this tree here. This is something I can count on, right? But is it? Is it really? The tree is just a tree. It doesn't care anything about the people hugging it. If they have enough to eat, to drink, do they have enough clothes to shield them from the cold wind? Nothing. The tree just grows itself. And that's what Ultima did. There was no place for humanity in his new world to begin with. There is one last thing I want to talk about before we move to the final boss Ultima. This is in a side quest, so some players might have missed it, but it's really important. It greatly complements the story of Barnabas, adding what I would say is a vital layer. This side quest is the final quest of the Undying. It's called Duty Undying Part 2. Clive receives the request from Cyril and travels to Ash to look for the third chair. When we arrive at a tiny village south to Istla, we find the man. But we also find the villagers to be quite weird. They're praying for their god to erase their free will. Initially, this seems ridiculous to us. The whole point of our journey has been to understand the weight of freedom and to accept it. I mean, how do you even do that? Erase your free will? We've just talked about this. You can't. Whatever you do, you're just deluding yourself into believing you're not free. Well, the third chair seems to be in doubt, talking about how his own faith wavers, and that he wants to help those people. Hell, the first time I played the mission, I thought the goal would be to purge him of these thoughts, drag him back from the brink, and maybe help the villagers see the error of their ways, to find meaning and purpose and hope in their lives. But no, what happened genuinely surprised me. And I think this is why they put it in a side quest instead of the main story. It's almost too radical for most people living in a modern society. What happened was, The monsters attacked, and the third chair sacrificed himself to save the villagers, after which the villagers turned Akashic because of the ether flood. If you reflect on it from a result-oriented perspective, I mean as a person standing in the aftermath, looking backward, you see his sacrifice as pointless. Why would you save them when, for all intents and purposes, they just wanted to die? The only difference is you help them die in another way. So we have this doubt, just like Clive does. Is this really the right thing to do? And with this question in mind, we go back to Cyril to report on his colleague's fate. And Cyril stated his view on this.
But he didn't die for your creed. He died to save them. And you still believe that what he did was right?
I believe that he believed it was. We of the Undying are not slaves, but willing servants. And this was his will, the ultimate expression of it.
And that is the point. If we truly value free will and we truly recognize others as free just like us, then we cannot just go around judging people how they exercise their freedom. What the third chair did was the ultimate embodiment of this idea. He not only didn't judge the villagers, he sought to understand them and choose to help them exercise their freedom. Even though how they want to exercise their freedom is unrelatable or even incomprehensible for him. But of course, suicide is just one case, an extreme case the game uses to drive home this point. It is too easy to write off other people's hope and dreams, saying that they just don't know it better like I do, that they don't know what's good for them, so I need to change them, to educate them, to elevate them, make them see that my way is the right way. But if you think about it, this is the kind of condescending attitude that led even the greatest philosophers of old, like Aristotle, to rationalize slavery. If we value freedom, if we really do, and not just claim that we do in a self-centered way, we have to recognize others' freedom too, acknowledge that they have equal value like ours. If we follow Sartre's line of thought that consciousness is freedom, the same can be said backward. Freedom is consciousness. And since my consciousness is really what holds me together as a human being instead of a bunch of circumstances loosely stacked together, to recognize the freedom of someone is to recognize the humanity of someone. If you played Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, here's a bonus for you. You remember the title of Emmett Selk? The third seat of the Convocation. And his whole character arc was to learn to recognize modern humanity after Sundering as truly human, like him and his ancient brethren. But before we end this section, I want to point out that this side quest takes place on Ash, the continent ruled by King Barnabas. It's actually arbitrary, the quest can happen wherever in Valencia, but the game wants you to draw parallels between the villagers and the king. As we talked about, Barnabas was just constantly exercising his freedom to surrender to Ultima. But was that not his freedom? Don't we need to respect his freedom too? Well, clearly no. He is the antagonist, and the villagers are not. In fact, the villagers are one of the rare cases where they turn Akashic, but you don't fight them. They just leave, peacefully. What makes them different is that the villagers are freely choosing for themselves. They are trying to end their own lives, and only their own. In reality, suicide is a lot more complicated. You're not just hurting yourself, but also the ones closest to you. But by simplifying this scenario, the game shows us how we sometimes take our freedom a bit too far, and make moral judgments as if we stand on this pedestal, when in fact, we're just one perspective to view a vast world. This is not to fall under moral relativism and say every perspective is equally right. Remember, we still have Barnabas as the antagonist, but we shouldn't judge other values just by merits of how in line they are with ours. You know who else took his freedom too far? Ultima. He's the king, not the god, of taking freedom too far. At first glance, Ultima may appear to be a rather bland antagonist. He suddenly appears out of nowhere, says archaic things in a monotone delivery. He seems to be just another god to be killed in a typical JRPG. But when you analyze him through the lens of existentialism and free will, he serves as a perfect foil to Clive, to our hero's journey. As the final boss, his conflict with Clive is more about methodology. After the confrontation with Barnabas, Clive's worldview is already solidified. He has accepted the final burden of freedom. We are indeed condemned to freedom. We are inherently subjected to human anguish and vertigo. So the question is, carrying this weight of freedom, where do we go from here? Well, Ultima's answer is, I will use my freedom to do whatever I want. Remember our initial discussion about the scope of freedom and how it isn't just the ability to do anything you wish? Ultima oversteps this boundary, considering his freedom to be boundless. The issue is, it is impossible for two entities to possess truly limitless freedom at the same time without causing a paradox, like an unstoppable force facing an immovable object. In the game, when we encounter Ultima's kin, as he called them, we notice they look identical to him. I don't think the devs are reusing character model to save budget. Instead, it is a way to emphasize that, to Ultima, only he himself is truly free. His kin are just extensions of his self. He has what I would call an oversaturation of self. Ever since the start, he constantly refers to himself as we.
We agree. No more games, Phoenix. We have come to claim our vessel.
Initially, Ultima addresses Clive as Mythos. Later, upon realizing the unanticipated strength of Clive's free will, he makes a remark about Logos.
This is no mere evolution, it is deviation. And herefrom does Logos rise.
So what is Mythos? Oxford defines it as a set of belief or assumptions about something. To me, it is spot on. Beliefs and assumptions don't have to be true, but we decide that they are. I don't know for sure what my purpose is, but here's someone descending from the sky telling me that he has everything figured out, he has a provision for me, so I'm convinced. I hold this belief and assumption that it must be true. To embrace Mythos is to surrender your freedom, just like Barnabas did. The evolution Ultima speaks of is the path he has set for humanity.
We sowed the seeds for you, Mythos, all that you might one day blossom.
He is unsure how far humans can travel this path and how long it might take, but there is a designed path where they won't end up where he doesn't want them to be. Logos, meaning reason in ancient Greek, represents a position where Ultima thinks he occupies. Clive, having strayed from the path designed by Ultima, is now challenging his monopoly over reason. That's why Ultima wants to destroy humanity, because he refuses to acknowledge that any entity is his equal, genuinely free. But that's where he is mistaken. Think about it. As human beings ourselves, how can we be certain that someone else is truly human? It might seem like an odd question, but bear with me. There's a thought experiment in philosophy called philosophical zombie. Imagine a zombie, devoid of thoughts and feelings, but his appearance, actions, and speech are indistinguishable from any human. In that case, how can we say for sure whether he is human or not? How can we be entirely certain that the people we meet every day, friends, colleagues, or even family, are not just super advanced Westworld level AIs? There is no absolute certainty. Acknowledging another being's humanity is essentially a leap of faith. We are actively choosing to believe the other is human. Many historical atrocities happened because the perpetrators chose to believe their victims were not human, or at least lesser than human. Consider slavery. Aristotle went to great length to distinguish slaves from humans, claiming they participate in reason only to the extent of perceiving it but do not have it. Note that we are talking about Aristotle here, who saw reason as the essence of humanity. If slaves can only perceive but not possess reason, they are naturally lesser than human. A dialogue between Jill and Sid in the game talks about this process.
But what makes them think they have the right to use us? To leave us to die when our bodies are spent?
Does a nobleman weep for a broken mug? A torn tunic?
Sid's response nails the issue. Dehumanization. This is what Ultima does to humanity, and what humanity often does to itself. Well, in a way, apples really don't fall far from the tree. But since we have freedom, we have the chance to grow and change. This process encapsulates the first point FF16's philosophical discourse aims to convey: rehumanization. In reality, this topic has an extremely wide range, fighting against racism, sexism, colonialism, and more. However, FF16, being a roughly 40-hour game, cannot cover everything, so it focuses on the macro perspective, on a fundamental level. To rehumanize, one must realize that every person living on this planet, like me, is free. Now, truly accepting the idea that others are as free as ourselves is more challenging than we might think. Because when we admit that other people are equally free as us, we renounce any kind of superiority we might have on a fundamental level. We become two equally insignificant entities navigating this disinterested universe in our equally validated ways. Any superiority we might perceive arises merely from our circumstances, and not from our consciousness, our free will. This brings us to Ultima's second mistake. Even though he claims to usher in a new age of reason, at his core, he was driven by a pursuit of superiority. Therefore, upon his freedom, he builds an overindulgence of control. Control over the nature, over humans, over what philosophers would call the other, with a capital O. The world isn't the way I want it to be, well, I'll just reshape it with magic. The little puppets I created are disobedient, I'll just crush them. But the problem is, such control is but an illusion. Undesirable setbacks still happen to him, like when the misuse of magic led to the Blight. In their final battle, Clive confronts Ultima with this line:
"You're afraid. You always have been. From the moment the Blight exposed what you were, weak, you conceived us to prove otherwise. But the results shook you to the core. For in us you saw yourself, and realized we had the potential to be more than you could ever be, and so you turned your back on your creation, your back on the world, like the coward you are."
When Clive says Ultima is weak, it's not to say he's not powerful, but that he has the delusion of possessing more power than he really has. When the Blight shattered his illusion of freedom, or perhaps more accurately, his illusion of omnipotence, he created humanity to re-experience that complete control. But that's just a diversion, an illusion of grandeur. Although he may have more control over the world than humans, he fundamentally faces the same adversities as them. Imagine two prisoners. One is confined to a vast, luxuriously furnished cell, while the other is crammed into a small cage. The prisoner in the larger cell laughs at the other one. "You pathetic thing, you can't even fathom the amount of space at my disposal." Yet he remains imprisoned. In this analogy, the walls of the prison represent our facticity. This doesn't mean we're not free, but whatever amount of freedom we have can only be exercised within the confinement of these walls of circumstance. Ultima is like the prisoner with the larger cell. He refuses to admit he is also trapped in a prison because the alternative would be terrifying. It would mean that he and the guy in the other tiny cell, in this case humanity, is the same. In humanity, he saw himself. During the final battle, Ultima drops the monotone delivery and speaks with this deep rage.
"I forbid it. You are not a god. You are but flesh and bone. You are not one of us."
He uses anger as a strategy to regain dignity in a sense. Ultima's entire identity is built upon his superiority. So it would be like killing him to accept that on a fundamental level, he is just like any human, that despite all the bells and whistles, he's also pathetic, he's also suffering, he has no real superiority over humanity. Ultima says Clive is not a god, and Clive says they're the same. Neither of them are wrong. If you look at Ultima's journey, he faces the challenges life throws at him, his will to power constantly suppressed by the world, and he strives endlessly to overcome those challenges, to expand his lot in life. Just like humans, which is precisely what Ultima refuses to acknowledge. So he turns his back on humanity, he holds contempt where there should have been sympathy. I think this is the second point the game tries to convey. For us, beings born as humans, condemned to be free within our constraints, have sympathy. Our Decade Gazette says our existence is like a shipwreck. Each individual desperately waves their arms and hands to stay afloat. Some may be stronger, maybe better at swimming, while others lag behind, nearly drowning. Yet they are all victims of the same disaster. To envy or mock any of them is absurd. Have sympathy for those who harm you like Kupka, for those who surrender like Barnabas, for those who delude like Ultima, because we are all lost on this journey of existence and all we have is each other. The final difference between Ultima and Clive is the most obvious but also very easy to overlook. Clive is mortal. Interestingly, Ultima wasn't born immortal. As he states in the game, he chose to cast aside his mortal coil, seeking immortality.
An unprecedented journey lay before us, one beyond the limits of our fleshly bodies, and so we cast them off. Thus stripped to our very spirit, did we find our new paradise.
So Ultima's view of time isn't anything like that of Clive and other mortals. When he was finally defeated at brink of death, he says this to Clive.
My congratulations. Relish this victory, knowing that you have but delayed the inevitable. Your world is already dead. May you enjoy an eternity on its blackened husk.
When Ultima says your world is already dead, I don't think it's referring to the Blight. Without the Mother Crystals, without the icons, the spread of Blight would have been stopped. Perhaps the absorbed ether might even gradually return to nature. In the final cutscene, we witness a world where icons and magic have become mere legends, and nature flourishes, teeming with life. Yet this world, and the universe for that matter, will ultimately perish. Nothing is truly eternal. For mortals, such ideas are distant, but for Ultima, they are an inevitable reality. In this sense, mortality becomes a blessing, allowing humans to fully enjoy their journey while it lasts. Before the destruction of the first Mother Crystal, Clive makes a joke about Cid's plan of going south.
Yeah, but that's half the fun of it. Life's too short for perfect plans. You want a plan that'll keep you on your toes, stop you growing old and complacent.
Worked for you, has it?
Clive, my boy, even life's smallest challenges offer the opportunity to grow and to change. You must embrace these moments. Allow them to suffuse your heart with a deep sense of fulfillment.
And if the passage to the inner sanctum is guarded?
Then we embrace the moment and use it to grow and change.
This banter between them made Jill chuckle, and it made me laugh too. Yet seeing the outcome of Ultima's overabundance of life, it seems these words are a part of Cid's timeless wisdom. Be grateful that our life has an end. Following Ultima's defeat, the story reaches its ending. With Jill's theme My Star playing in the background, Clive's life comes to an end. On one hand, it's heart-wrenching to witness the end of a beloved character with whom we've journeyed for so long. Some argue that Clive didn't die on that beach. Evidence is Joshua's book, Final Fantasy. The title likely comes from Clive's line during the final battle.
The world you seek is but a fantasy!
The only fantasy here is yours. And we shall be its final witness.
But I would say such arguments miss the story's point. Clive fought for a world where everyone can live and die on their own terms. In this sense, he exercised this freedom, saving Jill, the people of the Hideaway, and the entire world for that matter. Knowing that his body cannot sustain another spell, he chose to sacrifice himself to destroy Ultima's legacy. He lived and died on his own terms. Is that not the best ending he can get? Even if Clive didn't die at that moment, he would have long died in the world of the epilogue, as would have Jill, as would have Joshua. Stepping outside the story, these are fictional characters. They were never truly alive. But you know who are alive? We are. The gamers who got to experience this philosophical work of art. As Jill witnesses the fading of Metia the Red Star, knowing Clive is dead, He starts to cry and rushes out to the deck just as dawn breaks. A new day has started. In the meantime, the lyrics of the song go like this: that though our night is over, you shall always remain, forever my treasure, my star. Regardless of how much we cherish someone else's companionship or how profound our feelings are for them, everyone's journey has an end, and the other one has to continue without them. This applies not only to our significant half, but also to our friends, family, and everyone we meet in life. Ultimately, the journey of each one of us is deeply personal. But in our lives, there are people and events, whether real or fictional, that illuminate our path forward. Even when they're gone, their light becomes part of us, our star in the night, so we can march forward, unafraid of the dark. So thank you, UGP, thank you Final Fantasy XVI, for this incredible journey.